Okay, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Dorr, and I'm the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, where I focus on our nation's large safety net programs. Today, I'm very excited to host three conservatives who have, over the years, provided the best conservative ideas regarding safety net policy, from work requirements and stronger child support enforcement in the Welfare Reform Act of 1996 to the promotion of marriage and evidence-based policymaking and everything in between. It is my hope that our discussion this afternoon will provide direction and useful commentary for the Trump administration's ongoing social services efforts. In no particular order, I'd like to introduce our three guests. We're going to start from the left with Dr. Wade Horn, who is heading up the human services practice for Deloitte and is a psychologist by training, but is better known as the former Federal Department of Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary for Children and Families, a position in which he served after being nominated by President George W. Bush and confirmed unanimously. In that position, Dr. Horn oversaw over 60 federal programs aimed at improving the well-being of children and helping families achieve self-sufficiency, including welfare, child support, child care, and adoption. He has also served as Commissioner for the Children, Youth, and Families and Chief of the Children's Bureau within HHS and a presidential appointee to the National Commission on Children. He is a tireless advocate for marriage, family, and the welfare of America's children, committed to solving problems of child poverty and strengthening the American family. Ron Haskins, on our far right, is a senior fellow in economic studies down the block here at the Brookings Institution, where he is also the co-director of the Center on Children and Families. He is a senior consultant at the Annie E. Casey Foundation and was the president of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management in 2016. He is the author of multiple books, including Work Over Welfare, The Inside Story of the 1996 Welfare Reform Law, which I make all of my research assistants read before they begin a single day here at AEI. Mr. Haskins was recently appointed by Speaker Ryan to co-chair the Evidence-Based Policymaking Commission, which issued an influential report on how government can use data to make better policy. Most of all, for our purposes, Ron is a thoughtful and nuanced critic of welfare policy, and he's seen it a lot over many years. Finally, in the middle is Robert Rector, who's a senior research fellow at Heritage and is considered the intellectual godfather of welfare reform. He was integral in the passage of the 1996 bipartisan welfare reform law that transformed safety net policy. He is an experienced critic of welfare policy who, like Mr. Haskins, helped build it from the inside. Mr. Rector also has a terrific record of catching details in welfare-related policies that many others miss and holding government accountable for each and every one. He's without a doubt a major force in welfare policy, and I'm excited to hear his thoughts on where the Trump administration is and where it could go. Now, the format for today is going to be a series of questions and discussions, so we can have a little bit of a banter and back and forth. And I think it'll be a lot more fun than just standard presentations. And I'd also like to say that this may come as a surprise to some, but I've learned over many years that while there are lots of divisions in Washington between the left and the right and Democrats and Republicans, there are also some divisions among and between conservatives on social policy. So, and sometimes those divisions can become apparent, and they may become apparent in our discussion today, but we're going to try to keep it as polite as possible. But these three believe things very strongly. So if things get a little bit out of hand, look to me to try to calm us all down, and I'll do my best. So let's start. The way we're going to do this, I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm going to pose it to 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to change the order and ask another question, and we're going to go through as many questions as we can, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So the first question concerns family formation and the importance of two married parents in the raising of children. This is an issue all three of you have written about and cared about for a long time. You know that child poverty is 5 times higher in single-parent families than it is in two-parent families. Looking at the Trump administration so far, is this an issue that you think they are addressing well, and what would you like to see them do? Wade?
So first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here at AEI. Thank you all for coming. So I'm a little biased on this question because I was brought in 2001 to be the Assistant Secretary for the Administration on Children and Families, in part to formulate and then implement the President's Healthy Marriage Initiative. So I'm a little bit biased. I was affectionately known as the marriage czar for a period of time, and that gave my wife enormous power in our relationship, that she was married to the marriage czar. Let me first say that elections have consequences. And so every administration gets to determine what their priorities should be. And within the context of existing law, they get to set priorities. So I don't think it's any great mystery or secret or great criticism that the Obama administration approached the Healthy Marriage Initiative differently than the Bush administration did during my tenure. And largely what the Obama administration did is transform the Healthy Marriage Initiative from one which was about helping couples form and sustain healthy marriages to one which was about work. Not a bad thing, work's a good thing. And then also when it came to relationship education, pushing it down to teenagers to talk about healthy relationships with adolescents. Again, not unworthy things to do, but largely that the Healthy Marriage Initiative sort of got transformed by the Obama administration. So one of the things that I would hope that the Trump administration would do is resurrect the Healthy Marriage Initiative by actually using the word marriage from time to time, and refocus the money that was appropriated by the Congress for that purpose back towards helping couples who choose marriage for themselves form and sustain healthy marriages. There was a grantee meeting just recently here in Washington, D.C. of healthy marriage grantees and also responsible fatherhood grantees. And a good deal of that the conference was really focused on helping to educate the existing network of grantees as to the broad range of kinds of activities that you can do under those grants, including being more focused on the institution of marriage. I do think that we're hearing things come out of the Trump administration, which suggests that they're going back to a definition that's more consistent with the definition of the Healthy Marriage Initiative under the George W. Bush administration. And again, it's because elections have consequences. So I think that going forward, as sort of reestablishing what the Healthy Marriage Initiative is at its core, and then really seeking ways, I would urge the Trump administration to integrate that into a variety of different programs within the Administration on Children and Families, specifically in HHS more broadly.
So Robert, you've spoken often about the importance of promoting marriage and public messaging campaigns. I've once borrowed one of your ideas for New York City. Is the Trump administration doing enough on this?
Well, I hope they will be, because this is the paramount issue in welfare reform. If we went back 20 years ago to the creation of the TANF program, more than half of the debate that occurred in the House and Senate concerned the collapse of marriage. You should take it back farther to Moynihan and Moynihan's report on the family in '64. The issue in welfare reform is not to make single mothers work more. I mean, does anybody really think that the youth crime rate in Chicago is going to go down if single mothers work an extra 5 hours a week? The real cause there, the real handle which we can affect, and the real social change, the most momentous social change that we've had in our society, is that when the war on poverty began, 7% of children were born out of wedlock. Today, that number is 42%. All of those out of wedlock births occur among the least educated part of the population. This is a transnational phenomenon, as Sarah McClanahan is showing. This is happening in virtually every developed country, with marriage remaining strong in the upper classes and collapsing in the most vulnerable classes, always with extremely deleterious results. So if we actually are concerned about the well-being of poor people, which I think Washington generally is not, the first thing that you should do is try to bring the fathers back into the home just as Moynihan talked about 50 years ago. Welfare reform was a failure because we were able to mandate work requirements at the federal level. But on the issue of marriage, which was the more important one, we did not get any mandatory policies. Instead, 3 of the 4 goals of the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program pertain to sustaining and increasing marriage. And the state governments, with one exception, have spent 20 years absolutely ignoring the law. I think one thing the Trump administration could do is, in fact, begin to fine them because they are in violation of the law. They've been violating it for 20 years, red and blue governors. It's frankly disgusting.
Right.
And so what else can we do? I would strengthen the Healthy Marriage Initiative. There are very strong evaluations of particular programs. One evaluation I'm very fond of is a program that was run in the Army for enlisted men during the Iraq surge. It was called Prep for Strong Bonds. It reduced the divorce rate by 50% under a small random assignment experiment. I would say that what we want to take that healthy marriage money and put an emphasis on putting the message out about the importance of marriage. A lot of our marriage programs, I think, fail because it's as if we were running a smoking cessation program before the announcement, the Surgeon General's announcement in 1963 that cigarettes were harmful. Well, you're really rowing uphill then. You need to go out and very carefully and methodically explain for a very long time to the vulnerable populations that marriage is important, why it's important, and so forth. And then you can score programs on whether or not people receive and hear that message. Second thing I would do, that's the most obvious one, is we need to eliminate all the marriage penalties in the welfare programs. When a family where a mother earns $20,000 and the father earns $20,000, as long as they don't marry, they get an extra $4,000 out of the EITC. And then if they do marry and tell us about that, we take that money away. That is simply a psychotic system. It's absolutely, utterly undefensible. And the only reason that it occurs is on the Democratic side, they don't care about marriage, and on the Republican side, we're cheap. Okay, so it's a marriage of two great things coming together. So we run a welfare system that overtly and continuously discriminates against low-income couples that would choose to be married. We should eliminate the marriage penalty in the EITC. I've written a paper explaining how that could be done for as little as $4 billion a year. We should also eliminate it effectively in the food stamp program, which has a similar cost. All of those costs could be borne simply by eliminating the extensive fraud of $25 billion a year that exists in the EITC program. Those would be very good things. We should send a message out. We should put outcome requirements on the message, and we should stop discriminating against couples who do get married. We should stop pushing fathers out of the home.
So one thing about Robert, he likes marriage. He's not big on the states, not great friendly with the states or Democrats or Republicans, which that's you've got scorn for all in some cases. But I meant that in a nice
I've worked
way.
in this city a long time.
Yeah. So Ron, what about marriage and the Trump administration?
If you're trying to produce differences here, you failed on the first time out, so you'll have to think of another question. The only thing I would
start slow, Ron.
The only thing I want to do here is say, I like your proposals. I like your proposals. And I would want to say you left out a very crucial thing, which people do not mention. When the Republican Party had a huge marriage initiative, bigger than anything and ever, it was totally unprecedented. Actually three kinds of experiments with the community, with couples who were already married trying to stay together, and young couples who had a baby together who aren't married. We did random assignment studies of those. It's unheard of. An administration has a big, venturesome thing that they're willing to talk about. The president talked about, I was in a room once in the White House, Wade walked in and the president said, "Oh, there's the marriage man." It's amazing that we did it. Now, I think the interpretations were mostly fair. The marriage between young people, it makes so much sense. And if you went and visited these programs, I promise you, you'd be very impressed. The young couples, almost all not married, who had already had a baby together. And they wanted to be together, they wanted to stay together, they talked about it, they talked about strategies, and people would say, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore, and so forth, but it didn't have impacts. The married couple, though, the program for married couple, the results were better. There were a lot of significant impacts at the beginning. And even in the other program, for the Oklahoma program, which I think I visited about half the programs, and married, Oklahoma was really good. It was the best program. And they had a ton of impacts the first, at what, year and a half. Mm-hmm. And then at 3 years, they didn't have as many impacts, but the couples in the experimental group were more likely to still be together. So there were some successes. So I certainly would endorse that, but I would, and this is a slight exception, I think we need to have more evidence. Let me give you an example, Robert. We have a very good study of the EITC on people who are on TANF. And it was done by Achin Maag at Urban Institute. And they found that they took actual sample. The only way you know about the stuff is if you actually take the samples. So the theoretical stuff working out doesn't work because you got to describe the actual conditions of the people. And if you actually take a sample of couples who are cohabiting and then marry them and then calculate what happened to their benefits, overwhelmingly they did better. You know why? Because they're still in the range of the EITC where they're going up, and if they get married, they have more income. And so they actually make more money. So that's why I think we really need a lot more evidence. I would launch...
that study assumes no fraud.
Okay, but...
Wrong planet.
Well,
okay.
No, I don't think so. I disagree with that, Robert.
There's 25% of the funding.
All right.
I understand that, but that does not detract from the experiment. In any case, I'm sure, as logical and rational and reasonable as you are, you wouldn't disagree that we ought to know more about what the effects of the things we are trying to do before we do it.
Well, I think that on the question of this is I don't really care if someone were to say to me, oh, well, you remove the marriage penalties and you're not going to get a behavioral effect. I would basically take that and put it in the circular file and do the morally correct thing.
Okay, well, all right. That's why we live in a democracy, right? You get to have a vote and you get to say what you think at AEI.
Do you think the Trump administration's going to step up on this and talk about this a lot?
I don't think there's no evidence yet of what the Trump administration intends to do that I'm aware of.
Okay.
So it's kind of hard to say, you know, what they're doing, but it would be, this is a extremely important area. Robert called it one of the most important domestic issues, which I totally agree with. He didn't mention this, but we have a huge literature on effects on kids, which is really, I think, the central issue. And I can remember when we first started studying this back 45 years ago, the left was convinced, especially in universities, that it's not that big a deal. I remember several papers about, oh, it's not going to hurt the kids, and now we know it does hurt the kids. Okay. So that's a justification for doing it. I also think that we ought to try things with public announcements, and I really like the idea of explaining to young people how important marriage is. I'm not sure it can be done. I'm not sure they would pay attention, but boy, oh boy, if they knew the facts, they'd be a lot more careful about marriage.
All right, so something that the Republicans are talking a lot about, and that apparently the Trump administration does support, is increasing the child tax credit. And the president's daughter is making a big splash on this. And that is often referred to as something targeted at more middle-class families, not necessarily low-income families. And my question to you, Robert, is if we're going to have a bigger child tax credit, should it be refundable or not?
Well, the child tax credit is already refundable. It's called the additional child tax credit for reasons that make no sense, but that's the name of it, the ACTC. And when you combine the ACTC and the EITC, what you have is a system where a mother working full-time, full year at minimum wage with 2 kids gets a combined value of $7,500 out of those 2 credits. The ACTC is also work linked. You don't get it if you don't work, and I haven't heard any Republicans changing that work link. And so, in fact, I actually think that system could be made more generous. The problem is that both of those credits have massive fraud in them. with 1 out of $4 is going to fraudulent and erroneous payments. These are supposed to be work-based credits, but we measure work on the honor system. If you tell us that you worked, then you worked, okay? And when they audit that, they find that a lot of that work is shall we say, wishful thinking, that it never happened. The other problem with both of these credits is that 1 in 10 of the recipients don't actually even reside with the child. And when you measure the marriage penalties, the best way to measure it is assuming that the absent father in fact does get the credit if it's to his advantage, even if he's not in the same state, he's going to get it if it works out for the couple's benefits. That's why you have 1 in 10. It's to 2 to 3 million families where the recipient doesn't even reside with the child. The other one is when they're cohabiting, they can, the cohabiting couple can split their incomes, can assign any child they want to either party. And all of this is in my paper. And they're not stupid. They know how to game this system in order to maximize benefits. All of that gaming and those advantages, the income splitting and everything, is not available to married couples. So you need to do that. But I do think what you need to do with both the refundable ACTC and the EITC is to do really 2 things. One is to remove all the fraud. I've written extensively exactly how this can be done. And that frees up a lot of money. That's $25 billion in fraud right there that could be used to make these programs more generous. The other problem with the EITC and the ACTC, but particularly the EITC, is nominally this is a program which is designed to encourage parents to work. As your earnings go up, we're going to give you more. In that sense, it was a response to the failure of the negative income tax experiments in the 1970s. But there's not only the fraud, but the other problem is the credit isn't actually linked to the amount of work being performed in a year. So that if you have one mother who's working, say, $7 an hour and puts in 2,000 hours of labor, she will get $5,000 from the EITC. You could have another individual who makes $60,000 a year but was unemployed, was on sabbatical for 3/4 of the year. He gets exactly the same amount. It's truly stupid. Well, I actually have a guy in my office who is self-employed. He started his own company and went without salary for 11 months during the year because he didn't need the money, but he had a salary in the first month. So the next year, we paid him $5,000 in EITC payments because he had this small annual income. That's not what the credit's trying to do. It's a waste of money. And what you need to do is link the value of the credit to the number of hours worked and the wage rate together, and then you're going to have a very positive incentive system, even in the phase-down rate, because for each additional hour of work for a low-wage parent, they're going to get more credit, not less. Get rid of the fraud, get rid of the marriage penalty, link it to work, and you can make it more generous and still save money.
Before I go to Ron, let me just say, so if you don't do all those things, then you would rather it not be made more generous.
Well, you really can't make it more generous with this level of fraud, although I would say that it's a conservative myth. Oh, the EITC has a lot of fraud in it, unlike, say, HUD or food stamps or something. The reason that we know that the EITC has a high fraud rate is because IRS audits the EITC. USDA does not meaningfully audit the food stamp program, and it has even worse.
We'll come back to food stamps in a minute, but thank you. So, Ron, what about you? Are you? This is a big choice that Congress is going to make.
I think the motivation for Republicans is exactly what it was in '97. Clinton usually gets credit, but I think Republicans were really the prime movers to begin the child tax credit. And later it was made refundable. Republicans did that. It was in the initial Bush tax cut in the early 2000s. So I think that the Republicans have a very strong record here of helping low-income families and middle-class families. And if the whatever the tax bill winds up being, is going to be not hugely regressive, we have to have something like the child tax credit, because that's going to, and
the only way to make
it, especially if you continue the refundability, you might have to do something about refundability because there'd be a lot of additional money. But I think it's a very good idea. It's a solid thing, and the administration has talked positively about this, as you point out. Ivanka has apparently been on behind the scenes, lobbied a lot of people, met with them, and so forth. So I think it's a very good thing. I think, and it's kind of against the reputation of the Republican Party that they're those Republicans helping poor people again. I kind of like that headline.
All right.
And I think we should pursue it.
Wade?
So my support for refundable tax credit for children go back to when I was on the National Commission on Children, which issued its final report in 1991. I was in second grade, but I was on, it was a commission about kids. I was the kid representative.
Yeah.
And the central recommendation was $1,000 per child refundable tax credit. And I supported it then, I support it now for two fundamental reasons. The first is it recognizes that recognizes there is value to raising children, and that government ought to support and honor the value that parents provide to society by raising their children. And the second reason why I was supportive then and supportive now is because it fundamentally says, as it did in the report, because in that report there was about $65 billion worth of spending per year. 55 billion of that was in the refundable tax credit. And what that commission said was that if we're going to do something to support children, it's not to spend a huge amount of more money on government programs, but to put money back into the hands of families who are then given the ability to raise their children well and as they see fit. So both for a recognition of the value that parents provide to society by raising their children, and also by saying, hey, look, the most important, as someone once said, the most important Department of Health and, I think it was Health and Education and Welfare at the time, but the most important Department of Health and Human Services is the family. And we ought to honor it, and one way to honor it is by providing them resources that they need.
Okay. Ron, you're first in this one. So the Trump administration pointedly revoked the Obama administration's letter to states, which was never really used, which offered some flexibility to the work rules in the TANF program. And the Trump administration in the process reaffirmed their commitment to a work-first approach in that program. What more should they do in TANF?
I think we should have strong work requirements in housing, in TANF, of course, in food stamps, and even in Medicaid, even though Robert doesn't like that. The reason I think in Medicaid is really crucial, I think we ought to have a principle that we constantly emphasize to the American public. We think nobody should get a welfare benefit without giving back. It should be based on work. They have to either be preparing for work or actually doing work. That was our swan song during when we passed the welfare reform bill. It polled very well. Americans really think people ought to work. So I think we ought to, and I think the way to do this is through demonstration programs where we waive requirements in all of those laws, and if the states have an idea about how to make people work, that we would be willing to waive the law. I was never against the Obama change, even though we had put a provision in the bill they couldn't make changes in Section 407, which is where all the work requirements are. But I think it's a good idea. We ought to be doing those kind of experiments and learn more about how we can help people work. The basic problem, I think, in the United States is that we have too many people who don't work. There's no question now it's getting worse. It's been getting worse for 40 years. So we should not rescue people who don't work without expecting something in return. I think we should do it across all programs. And if states have a good idea how to do it, let's let them do it.
Wade?
So I think the TANF law was a great success. And it was a great success initially because states were scared. They were scared that there would be real consequences for not running very effective welfare work programs. What happened over the years is that gradually they became less scared, and we do not have, I believe, in most states today, a functioning TANF program. And one of the reasons is because this thing called the caseload reduction credit, which allows states to reduce their targets for work participation based upon certain things that they can do. And here's the statistic that I railed against for 6 years as Assistant Secretary. 57%, that's 6 in 10, 57% of all work-eligible adult TANF recipients when I was Assistant Secretary did not do a single hour of any activity in the prior month that involved preparing to go to work, looking for work, or going to work. They didn't do an hour of education. They didn't do an hour of training. They didn't do an hour of work search. They didn't do an hour of unsubsidized employment. They didn't do an hour of community service. They didn't do an hour of subsidized employment. Not 1 hour of anything in the prior month. 57%. Do you know what the percentage is today? 52%. I mean, it's stunning. When people tell me we are running great welfare to work programs through the TANF program, I say, how can you be doing that when so few people are engaged in doing even an hour? I mean, an hour? It seems to me that the most important thing that a TANF program can do, as Ron suggested, is to engage people in doing something. That I don't care what it is, job training, education, job search, unsubsidized employment, something. And I know a lot of states say, well, 20 hours a week is too much, 30 hours a week is too much. Why about an hour? Just an hour, and when you've got 6 out of 10 who aren't doing even an hour of anything, how can you say you're engaging your caseload? So what I hope that, and I see some of the Trump administration officials in this room that have something to say about this, that they will focus on this central question of engagement of people in the caseload. Because you cannot help someone if you do not engage them.
Robert?
Well, I think this is a pretty good example of trying to open eyes about the mythology, the conservative Republican mythology, that all you really need to do is just collect this money in Washington and dump it on the states and wow, watch them go. Well, you just heard them, okay? Because those numbers have been true for 20 years for red and blue states. My favorite is that we created 7 block grants under the Reagan administration, which include community development block grants, social service block grants, so forth. States can do anything they want to with those programs. We've spent $600 billion. I have a standing bet. I'll pay $200 to anybody who can show 1 dime of that $600 billion having gone to a conservative purpose. It simply is like dumping water in the middle of the Sahara Desert. It absolutely just disappears into these state bureaucracies, and that's what TANF is like today. So clearly half the TANF recipients are completely idle. Clearly the state bureaucracies and state elected officials could care less, with the exception of a few states. And so clearly we would want to have stronger work requirements. But you also have to be very alert to state gaming. There's a little thing called a disregard. It's not the caseload reduction credit that does this, it's the disregards. And to understand what a disregard is, I'll give a clear example. Let's say you wanted to raise the work rate in your TANF program without doing anything at all. Okay, which state bureaucrats are really good at this. We think they're stupid. They are on the ball. Okay?
I was a former state bureaucrat.
Yes, and so how can I raise the work rate in TANF without doing anything at all? I know I will go out and give every family that makes less than $16,000 and is working a TANF benefit worth $10 a month. And all of a sudden, the percentage of my TANF caseload that's working went up amazingly. And in fact, if you look at these national funds, we had a surge in work last year alone. A surge, Steve. Wow. And what caused that? It was because California did this across the whole population and added like 700,000 working families to TANF. Way to go, states, okay? So we have to have serious work requirements in food stamps and housing. We have to make the work requirements in EITC real rather than fictitious. And then we ought to have work requirements in TANF as well. But TANF is basically a small potato players now. It's now, if you want to reform the welfare system, we now spend $5 in fraud in the EITC for every $1 we spend in TANF cash benefits. Okay, that's how irrelevant this is. So we have to go after the program where all the people are, where all the money is, which is EITC and food stamps.
So Wade, I was going to ask about that. TANF is much smaller. The failure to engage the TANF caseload is a problem, but it's a smaller caseload. But there are now millions and millions of Medicaid recipients and SNAP recipients who report no earnings on their case. You know, is the Trump administration do anything about that? And are they going to do anything about it? And what should they do?
Well, the two big programs where the people are SNAP and Medicaid. And it seems to me that, I mean, there is a sort of work requirement in the SNAP program that was suspended for a lot of years because of the recession and sort of triggers to get waivers out of the work requirement. But a lot of those waivers have now expired because unemployment is down. And some states are starting to take seriously, again, the work requirement within SNAP. The problem with SNAP is that if you're a governor and you say, okay, what I'm going to do is going to get tough on SNAP recipients, and they need to go to work for some period of time, some number of hours per month in order to continue to get SNAP benefits. And then the person doesn't do it, they drop off the rolls. What happens? They lose their SNAP benefits. Well, SNAP benefits are 100% federally funded. So you save no money in your state budget, but what you've now lost is money coming into your state to buy food in your state supermarkets, your 7-Elevens and so forth. So there, I think the incentive is difficult, and you're going to disagree with me on this, and I know, and I'm going to let you do that. But I'm going to go to Medicaid, because I think that's where the real bang for the buck is. And here's where the Trump administration has signaled it really wants to do something about able-bodied adults who are receiving Medicaid benefits, and that they believe, the Trump administration does, that they ought to either exchange for free health care, they ought to do something for some number of hours that either involves preparing to go to work, looking for work, or going for work. So then Secretary Price and CMS Administrator Seema Verma sent a letter to all the states, governors, saying, hey, look, one of the things we want you to do is send us 1115 waivers in Medicaid. And one of the things we would like to entertain, specifically called out, was implementing work requirements for able-bodied adults in Medicaid. Now, I'll tell you, this is an issue that work polls 85 to 90% positive in every poll I've ever seen. If you ask the average American, if someone gets a public benefit and they're able-bodied, should they do something in return for that benefit? And is that something? And that something is looking for work, preparing to go to work or going to work. It polls positive. 85 to 90% say yes. You can't get 85 to 90% of Americans to agree that water is good when you're thirsty. And so the poll is just off the charts. So what's the benefit of this? First of all, there are three benefits to putting work requirements in Medicaid. The first is it plays into this, I think, American sense of reciprocal responsibility. We're going to help you, but if you're able-bodied, you should do something in return for that benefit. So it plays into that value. The second thing it does is it helps the recipient. One of the things we know is that when people lose jobs, what happens? Their health status goes down. Less well known is if someone gets a job, their health status improves. And that is true whether they got a job because, you know, it's not just because they were healthy to begin with, but if they were on public benefits to get a job, their health status actually improves. There are two consensus reports, one out of the UK, one out of New Zealand, that document this quite clearly. They're a little bit old right now. I would hope that HHS will do something similar here in the United States, look at the literature on this. So there is a health benefit to going to work, which fits into what the Medicaid program. The Medicaid program is not about giving you a card, an insurance, but improving your health. Work can improve your health. And the third thing it does is When people leave Medicaid, go to work, they're more likely to get health insurance through their employer. Guess what that does to state budgets? It eases the pressure on state budget because states are putting a lot of their own money into the Medicaid program. So I'm very bullish on this idea. I know a lot of people aren't, maybe even some people in this room, but I think it's really an interesting idea, one that we should at least be experimenting with going forward in the Medicaid program.
Robert, work in other programs? You've already said a lot on this, so you don't have to say too much.
Well, one thing you have to be very careful with is a perennial policy option, which is what I call Republican sham work requirements, okay? So Republicans—
I'm not in favor of those.
What?
I'm not in favor.
You're not in favor of those. So in reality here, let's talk about the group that's really benefited from the Medicaid expansion, which is able-bodied adults without kids, okay? Now, we have a proposal by many members in the House and Senate to actually impose a work requirement on that group in the food stamp program. We've actually done that in the state of Maine and the state of Nebraska with great drops in caseload, and so we actually know how to work that, and we know the consequences of it, and so forth and so on. Now, we're going to be doing something on food stamps and the agriculture bill coming up shortly here. What do you think that are the odds that we will have an ABODS work requirement in the food stamp program, okay? I'm not holding my breath for that, okay? And even though 90% of Republican grassroots and 90% of Democratic grassroots would support that type of policy, are we going to do it? No. So if we're not actually going to do a work requirement on this population in food stamps where it actually already partially exists in law, I know what we'll do. We'll talk about doing it in the Medicaid program where it's much, much more difficult to do it because any work requirement inherently involves not providing services when the person doesn't do their part of the requirement. And so with this population, almost any individual who is going to be in Medicaid as a single able-bodied adult is also getting food stamps, okay? So, and we know how to do the work requirement in food stamps, and we know that it's effective, and we have a vehicle coming up for it, and so then we're going to shift. And we're going to talk about something like a state option for work requirements in Medicaid. Well, a state option is not worth a bucket of warm
We've already
spit.
been down that path.
Okay. So,
okay. All right.
We may get a really vigorous work requirement in Wyoming through that, okay? We'll have Wyoming locked away, all right? But New York, California, Massachusetts, Michigan, no, okay? So I do not want to scam the base by pretending to do something which isn't real. And so I would say, if you're going to do work requirements, start with the programs where you already know how to do it, food stamps, TANF. EITC, all these single moms are also getting EITC, and it's a sham work requirement. You can actually fix that by regulation, by ensuring that the data on employment comes in before you make the payment. You don't have to do anything beyond that. All of a sudden you've made EITC into a much more vigorous work program. Are we going to do that? Not holding my breath, okay? But we can have a state option for work in Medicaid. I've been in the city too long to fall for that.
But it's not either or. It can be both and.
It ends up either or.
Ron?
I'm going to endorse what Wade said at the risk of
upsetting Robert.
Arm's reach of Robert here. So I hope he doesn't commit any act of violence on me. But look, the addition of Medicaid adults because of Obamacare resulted in 9 million adults being on Medicaid who are not disabled and could meet a work requirement. And 5 million of them, almost 5 million, are in households with no worker. So if we're serious about the work message and want to meet the 90% of Americans who think we should do it, I think we have to do Medicaid. Now, I do agree with Robert. We haven't done this before. There are health risks. There are lots. We just don't know enough about this. I differ with Robert. I think the states are capable of being the laboratories of democracy. They certainly were during the days of the Low Income Opportunity Board under the Reagan administration. Did a lot of good stuff. We evaluated with very good research designs, random assignment and everything, and they were having real impacts. That's how, I think that's the main reason we got welfare reform. We could do that again. That's the way we should start. We should, already 5 states have applied to HHS for waivers to try to have a work requirement in Medicaid. Let them do it, and require an evaluation so we can actually learn from what they do. I think it's a very good idea, and especially now with so many jobs available, this is the time to do it.
Right. I would just add that also, Medicaid is an insurance program, so that you lose the insurance and the reliability of having the card if you don't comply with the requirement. You don't necessarily, and you shouldn't lose what Robert was saying was that you still have to care for someone if they're sick. But it is true that if people know they have insurance, they have different decision making with regard to their employment circumstance. And so having a requirement might get them more likely to go into work.
I think it's very likely to see the Republicans with the 90% support on this issue working for benefits, which was the issue which put Bill Clinton in the White House in 1992, to punt on that, do nothing serious about work in food stamps, nothing serious about work in the EITC, but to give us a cosmetic fig leaf about state options for work in Medicaid. I've been in this
and an increased child tax rate too. So that could happen to you, Robert. You know, get out there.
But wait,
I'm more optimistic than he is. Because the conversations that I hear both around people who are in the Trump administration on the Hill is not either or. In fact, it's more bold than having work requirements in separate programs. It's starting to think about a single system of work supports for people who are receiving public benefits. So whether you come in the Medicaid door, the SNAP door, the TANF door, that you move into a single work support program that moves you towards employment, and that your condition of receipt of all of those is conditioned upon you're cooperating with that single system of work supports. So I think that rather than seeing this as a potentially failed opportunity, now I agree, Republicans have never failed to take an opportunity, but it seems to me that there is a moment when it is possible for us to start to think even more boldly, because I think it would be a bad thing to have, here's the CMS work program, here's the SNAP program, here's the TANF program. Well, all different criteria, all different, you have different systems. Instead, it should be one like no wrong door into a work support program if you're able-bodied and having all of those public benefits dependent upon your cooperation.
Right, and it's also worth pointing out that even if you link together all of the programs, you're very likely to still be in poverty. But if you combine them with earnings...
Wait, that's just not true.
Well,
there's a great study from CRS based on census data, so it's nationally representative,
right.
And it shows that for single mothers now, just single mothers,
right.
If they go to work as a group, and you add the benefits, EITC, and all the things we've talked about here, it cuts the poverty rate in half.
That's what I just said.
I thought you just said they may not go out.
No, earnings is the key. You can't do it unless you work.
Oh, okay, all right.
If you're just knitting together the programs without earnings, it's nice that you're able to get these programs, I guess, people would say, but you're not helping them get out of poverty unless you have a work engagement component.
Let me just
I'm glad we cleared that up.
have a second here. Yeah, it took a while because you talk like a New Yorker. And
I know. See?
Listen. There is an entirely different motivation for governors in Medicaid. Now, it's evaporated a little bit because of the way Obamacare is structured, but in the other states pay almost half, about 46%, something like that. For every person they get off Medicaid, they're going to save a lot of money. It's not like food stamps. I guarantee you there are a number of governors out there who would love to figure out if they could help people get off Medicaid, and I think we ought to let them try it.
All right, so now, you all call yourself conservatives. Robert, you're first up on this one. Robert,
that for governors, state money is real, federal money is not real. And that's the guiding principle for understanding anything that happens in the welfare state.
Are you guys okay with a big tax bill that blows up the deficit? Are you worried that it might slow economic growth and job creation and increase people on assistance? Robert?
Well, I'm not a macroeconomist, thank God. But our people basically tell me that it doesn't matter that much how the government takes money out of the economy, whether it takes it out by borrowing or taxes. I think that the bottom line in welfare, we spend enough money here, okay? I'm not opposing credit to go into working in middle-class families for children. That's a fine idea. But we spent $1.1 trillion last year on assistance to low-income people through 80 different federal programs, cash, food, housing, medical care. And the problem is that those programs penalize marriage. They don't encourage work. And those that are targeted toward behavioral change are largely ineffectual. And so I think what we need to do is take that existing money and make it much more effective. And I think that we can easily do that because it's very ineffective now. If you're going to have a work-based program, it should really be work-based instead of
deficits and debt don't worry you about the economy.
I'm not a macroeconomist.
Okay, I might not be a macroeconomist, but damn it, I can add. And this is the greatest problem the country faces. We are going further and further and further in debt. We're going to have almost $700 billion increased debt this year under Republican-controlled House and Senate. We increased the debt ceiling without even cutting any spending. It's outrageous. And now we're talking about we could add another $1 trillion over 10 years because of tax cuts. It's crazy. Yes, I'm bothered by it. I don't think we should do it. And I think this is one of the things that
it's not very conservative either.
What?
Never mind.
Here's another point. I think one of the reasons the American public likes Republicans is because they see them as worried about the money. You're going to take good care of our money. You're going to make sure we don't have an unbalanced budget. You're going to make the books add up. And we're losing that reputation. We had it until, say, a year ago, 2 years ago, but now we've done so many things. And if we do $1 trillion or $1.8 trillion, the first estimate by the Joint Tax Committee of the Trump tax code was something like $4 trillion over 10 years. It's devastating not just to the country and to our future, but to the Republican Party.
Wade?
So I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm not a mathematician. And I don't play one on TV. But the only thing I would add to this conversation is that, as I understand the way that CBO scores a lot of these things, is they do what's called static scoring and not dynamic scoring. And the whole idea, as I understand it, of tax cuts is that is a stimulant to the economy, and when the economy grows, there is more money for the government to take in the form of taxes. So if that is correct, if that sort of is correct, then I think the premise of your question is not correct, which would suggest that every tax cut always adds to the deficit. Now, is the deficit real and something we should be worried about? Absolutely, absolutely. But on the other hand, I mean, if it is true that the economy, one of the brakes on an economy is overregulation and overtaxation. And if you at least take, the Trump administration is trying to deregulate, it's trying to, take the taxes away. And if that stimulates the economy so that we're not stuck at, 1.2, 1.3% growth, but instead see sustained growth, as we, this 3.2% growth that we just saw, and then maybe even bump it up to 4%. If that does that, then I think it will have achieved its purposes.
Yeah. Okay.
Robert,
yes?
If we take a $2 trillion gamble that it will increase economic growth, will increase tax returns, supply side argument, it's crazy to take a $2 trillion. Especially besides that, it didn't work that well in 2001.
Right.
So yeah. I don't know why someone would think that they're willing to put us further in debt and pass the bill on to our children and grandchildren on the chance that it's going to increase economic activity.
But it worked in 1960, and it worked in 1980.
Well, the economy is pretty strong now, and it being strong has made it easier to fight poverty because jobs are available, and poverty is going down. And if we do something that blows it, it's going to be a lot harder to help people get out of poverty because there aren't going to be any jobs. Sorry, I waved out of my role as the questioner, not the thing. So now let's talk about immigration. And Ron, you're first. Will the Trump administration policies on immigration increase wages and job opportunities for recipients of assistance? And will that lead to less poverty? And how do you feel about a deal on DACA?
I like a deal on DACA. It's a principle of American law that kids aren't responsible for their own behavior. It seems a slight extension to say they're not responsible for their parents' behavior either. I completely agree that kids, especially younger kids, were brought here by their parents. And now to hold them accountable when they've been Americans all their lives, many of them cannot even speak the language in the country they came from, I just don't know why we would do that. In general, I think it's a problem for Republicans who used to be pro-immigration that we seem to be now quite anti-immigration. It's a big mistake, I think, especially if we have a point system like Australia or Canada have, where we are selective in who gets admitted into the country. Not 100%, let's say 40% based on family relations like now, but 60% based on a point system. We could get, and we regularly get spectacular people in the United States who were born in other countries and come here to be educated. So we should be a lot friendlier toward immigration altogether, but we should not throw these kids out, 700,000 kids or whatever the count is. We should not do that.
Okay, Wade?
So I don't think Republicans are anti-immigration. I think they're anti-illegal immigration. And so looking at DACA in isolation is not the thing. That what you have to do is look at comprehensive immigration reform that includes securing the borders so that there is an orderly process for immigration. So I'm gonna use for the first time in public, an analogy or metaphor, I forget, I get those two confused.
Yeah, I can't ever get
but imagine that you're having a party at your house. If this doesn't work, tell me, and then I'll never use it again. But imagine you're having a party at your house, and and everything's fine. And you start to notice a couple people you don't recognize. That you've never seen them before. They're not causing trouble. They're not causing trouble. But they're eating your hors d'oeuvres, and they seem to be getting along with people. And more of them are coming. And pretty soon you see there's a fairly large number of people in your home that you didn't invite. You don't know who they are. What do? Do you start to yank people out of your house? No. The first thing is you secure your front door. And you say, look, until I can figure out what's going on here, we're not letting anybody else in. And then we'll deal with the people, because they're not bad people. They're doing fine. They're acting. And we'll deal with the people who are here, but we have to do something about the front door. We have to secure our borders so there's a more orderly process for immigration. And I think that's something most Americans agree with. I think it is false to say that Republicans are anti-immigration. I agree with you. And in fact, what you described was a legal immigration system, which I think is what most Americans agree with. To have an orderly system that allows people to come in, I think is something that everybody agrees with. I think the Trump administration agrees with that. And so I can't just take DACA in isolation.
Robert, immigration and poverty, how are they related?
Well, first of all, on DACA, DACA is not widely understood. DACA is, in fact, a general amnesty. Why is that? Because if you grant this conditional amnesty and a green card status to the child, when the child turns 21, they have an unconditional ability to petition for green card status for their parents. So in fact, every DACA child who is granted this status would in fact also then be able to grant permanent status to their parents once they hit 21. You could call this a backdoor blanket amnesty. Would people do that on the Hill? Oh no, that would be dishonest and deceptive. And we don't ever do that in this city. So the reality is that we have an immigration system both through legal and illegal immigration that fosters the inflow of very low-skill immigrants. And those low-skill immigrants, I'll ask this question, right? How many people in this room believe that an individual born in the United States or elsewhere who does not have a high school degree pays more in taxes than they take out in government services? Does anybody believe that? Put your hands up. Okay, but somehow when it comes to illegal immigrants who have an average education level of 10th grade, they're going to pay more in taxes than they take out in benefits, especially after you grant them amnesty, which allows them access to all 80 means-tested welfare programs and to Social Security and to Medicare. It's inordinately expensive, as the National Academy of Sciences showed in a very, very long book, which they wrote about this last fall, which is very similar to the book that they wrote about this 20 years ago. It doesn't really matter whether a high school dropout is born south of the border or born in Kentucky. That individual in our system is going to, through his lifetime, pay very little in taxes and take out lots and lots and lots in government benefits. The average, and most of these illegal immigrants or low-skilled legal immigrants who are actually more expensive because they're eligible for everything from the get-go, they have kids. The average cost of a child in the public education system in the US is $12,000 a year. Now, exactly who believes that a person with a 10th grade education is going to be paying $24,000 a year to finance their kids' education alone? People say, oh, well, maybe if they don't get welfare. In fact, if you look at this type of low-skill immigrant, in order to make them fiscally solvent, where they paid enough in taxes to cover the outflow of the services that they consume, you would have to eliminate public education, all the welfare programs, and Social Security and Medicare. Now they're at fiscal balance, okay? And so it's just absolutely silly, and it's preposterous. And the people that are advocating this actually are trying to say that there really is no redistribution in the United States.
Well,
but anyway, so you don't want to have a system either through illegal immigration or legal immigration where you have any sort of large numbers of people with a high school degree or less, because they're very fiscally costly. Somebody has to pay for it, and a lot of those somebodies are sitting in this room. Secondly, immigration cannot be conceived simply in government spending terms or in economic terms. People want to come to the United States because of the political culture of the United States. Now, the other thing that we have to be aware of is that immigrants surprisingly register 2 to 1 for a political party that starts with the letter D, okay? and they are 50% less likely to register and vote for the political party that starts with the letter R, okay? And therefore, when you bring immigrants in of any education level, they are in fact altering the political balance in the United States. You're changing the political culture in the United States. And to say that that somehow should be ignored is, I think, nuts. People want to come to the United States because of the unique political culture of the United States, the belief in basic liberties, in free markets, in property rights, in rule of law, and so forth. And to assume that unlimited immigration coming in has no effect on those things and no effect on the political balance in the U.S. is, I think, simply to ignore what's going on.
Well, it's funny, Robert. Now I'm going to have to follow up on that one with you, because previously you showed no real sympathy to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and also no real interest in fiscal discipline. And you based your answer on that one on both of those too. But I thought you had written elsewhere, and what I thought you were going to say was the impact on wages at the bottom. It came from low.
There's so many things to say here. So indeed, it's pretty obvious to anyone who looks at this that one of the effects of massive low-skill immigration is to push wages down. I think George Borhurst's figures show at least a 10% drop in the wages of low-skill American workers, who incidentally, those wages really have been flat in the bottom half of the population for close to 40 years now. I mean, way to go, guys. But we really need another 40 years of that, you know. And somehow, miraculously, people who have taken microeconomics understand that if you increase the supply of labor, it tends to push wages down, except if it's immigration, in which case everything is reversed and no economic laws pertain. The other thing that seems very clear to me, and the black sociologist at Harvard, Orlando Patterson, has written to a degree about this in his recent book, that the immigrant labor is really functioning to push black male labor right. It's not reducing their wages, it's pushing them right out of the labor force. And I think that's very clear. And so one of the things that is always perplexing to me, because I wear two hats. I work on immigration and I work on welfare. And so if I'm in a welfare meeting with both parties, we hear, oh, well, we need immigrants to do the work that Americans won't do. And then I go into the next room where I'm with a bunch of liberals on welfare and stuff, and they say, there are no jobs for poor people, and that's why they commit crime, and that's why they have to be on welfare, and that's why they're not married, and so forth and so on. You really can't have it both ways. And I think it's very clear that we have a real crisis in the collapse of labor force participation of low-skilled workers, both white and black, but particularly blacks, and a system that wants to simply have a sort of unlimited ongoing increases of foreign workers to come in and compete with that, our most vulnerable group, is, I think, just almost unbelievably bad policy.
Okay, now we're going to turn to teen pregnancy and evidence. This is a little bit of an in-the-weeds question for those of us who are here, because there was a Trump administration decision on teen pregnancy programs. And as you answer the question, if you also want to address, well, we may get to that after this. So let's do this first. The Trump administration cut the teen pregnancy programs after reviewing evaluations which they said showed very little impact. Was this a good move? And if the cuts remain in place, will it lead to a reversal in the long-term decline in teen pregnancy? And it's Wade, Robert, Ron.
So first, to be accurate, the Trump administration did not cut the program. What it did was it said there were a current cohort of grantees who had been given a 5-year grant, and they said, what we're going to do is we're going to end those grants after 3 years as we reassess. This is what the Trump administration says, as we reassess, you know, what's the right way to go forward with this program based upon evidence that I think Ron will disagree with the Trump administration on their evaluation of, but at least the Trump administration's evaluation of the curriculum that were being used in this program was basically largely ineffective. So why continue with the curriculums that have been demonstrated to be ineffective for another 3 years when the prior evaluation of them showed that they were ineffective? So they didn't cut. Now, to be fair, they did cut the program out in the budget, the proposed budget. So I just want to make sure we're clear that they didn't. That mostly what's being argued is not the budgetary cut, but the fact that these grants lengths were cut short. You know, I mean, it depends. To me, it depends on what the administration does next. I mean, if the administration next takes a serious and thoughtful look at what the evidence is as to the best way that we can address not just teen pregnancies, but sexually transmitted diseases as well. Because one of the things that's interesting in a sort of tragic way is everyone is very familiar with that teen pregnancy rates are going down. What they do not, is not as widely known, is sexually transmitted rates are at historic highs. So while we can all celebrate the reduction in teen pregnancy rates, we should not be celebrating the increase in sexually transmitted disease rates. So, so what the Trump administration, as I understand it, is doing a reassessment. How do we address both of them in an effective way? And that at least their assessment evaluations that were done on the existing curriculum suggest that it was not being effective in addressing both those areas.
Robert, you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. Well, first of all, teen pregnancy is not really a very valid measure of what you're trying to do. And teen pregnancy historically has been a measured success by saying, well, the girl would have given birth when she was 19. Now we're going to shift it, and we're going to have an out-of-wedlock birth when she's 20 and a half. Wow, victory. And in fact, when you look at the data, that kind of age shifting has very little impact The real question is whether the mother is married and in a stable marriage when the child is born and whether that marriage is sustained. But this particular issue brings up a broader issue about all the programs. Of the $1.1 trillion we spend helping poor people, about 5 to 10% of that are in programs which I call behavior change programs or enabling programs. They're things like anti-recidivism programs or teen pregnancy reduction programs or drug abuse prevention programs, things where the goal is to clearly alter a behavior. Now, what we had in this particular case is really rather interesting because these were 10 programs that had undergone random assignment evaluation and had been shown to have effect. I didn't like any of these programs, but they had been shown to have effects. And then they took them and they replicated them, okay? This is what we called evidence-based policy. And they took, and this is easy to replicate because these are actually, you've got curricula here. Much easier to replicate than a normal program. Took them, put them in place someplace else, and virtually none of them worked, okay? I had another example of this at the Secretary's Innovation Group of State Secretaries where we listened to a presentation about this anti-recidivism program that took place in Hawaii, and they were showing, it was random assignment, unbelievable, 50% drop in recidivism, crime down 65%, and you're going, you know, wow, this is nirvana. And then they said after this, and then we took this program and we replicated it in Michigan and Ohio, and it had no effect whatsoever, okay? That is the dilemma that we face here. And this whole idea that you can do, I love random assignment and so forth, but that you can take a program, figure out what it's, find one that works, take it and replicate it and get the same thing. It's not true. I have an entire office full of studies basically showing that fact. So how do you get around that? And the way I say that you get around that is to the extent possible, you don't try to replicate models because we really can't do that. You pay for outcomes. So in the simplest case, if I have a drug treatment program where you're supposed to stop using illegal drugs, I'm going to pay the service provider on the basis of clean urine cups, okay? The more clean urine cups you give me, the more money you're going to get. And if I start doing that faithfully and intelligently, I don't have to then sit down and dictate how that's going to happen, okay? I'm just paying for the outcome. Moreover, the whole idea that you can take a program and we'll do this study and then somehow the money is going to magically move over and be replicated. Anyone who has ever sat on a grant review panel knows that's not true, okay? That is not true. That is not what happens, okay? If you haven't been on a grant review panel, you know nothing about how federal money is spent, okay? But the money does not move like that. Okay, so what you want to do is say, look, what we're going to do for service providers is provide a substantial part of the revenue that you're getting, not pay for performance, which is services provided, but payment for outcomes. And moreover, if you make more money, the money is going to shift to you. You'll get more and more clientele. They did this in New York City under Robert Doar and Jason Turner. And what they found was they had all these providers providing employment services, most of whom didn't produce anything. But you put them on this pay for outcome basis, guess what? All the bad providers dropped out because they couldn't make any money. It's what you could call this marketizing social services. You don't, in a market, you don't get any money unless you get customers to buy your product. In social services, we shouldn't be providing money to providers unless they provide a measurable outcome for us. Reinforce it with random assignment to make sure we're measuring things correctly, but move that money automatically rather than dwelling with the idea that somehow we can do another round of MDRC studies, learn God knows what from that, and then come over here and 7 years later replicate those on the assumption that we're going to do.
Thank you for the compliment, but I got to cut you off because I want Ron to go.
Okay, so the Office of Adolescent Health last summer published the results of 41 mostly random assignment studies. And depending on how you look at this, both of our friends up here, still friends, have said there were no impacts or very low impacts. If you eliminate, of those 41, 12 of them were flawed, like the kids were too young for some of the measures and that kind of thing. 40% of the programs produced at least one impact. And of the programs that measured impact on teen pregnancy, difference between experimental and control group on teen pregnancy, half of the ones in one of the tier 2 of the study had impacts, and 25% in the others. So there were definitely impacts from these programs. Now, programs don't work. This is something widely misunderstood. Our programs do not work. It's been shown time and time again in medicine, in social programs, and in business even, that about 80 to 90% of programs that are tested carefully by random assignment or other good designs fail. All right, so that's what we're up against. Robert makes a good point about replication is very difficult. In fact, I think I've written this, that that's the Achilles heel of evidence-based policy. But I don't think we should give it up. I think we should keep going and try to figure out what it is about specific programs that produces impacts. We do have a number of programs produce big impacts, like the SEED program here, right here in Washington, D.C. They have big impacts on kids. And a number of home visiting programs have big impacts on kids. So we can produce impacts, and they can be replicated sometimes, usually not. So we need to fight the usually not. And that's why I think it was a bad idea for the administration to abandon this program, because depending on how you count again, we did a big argument about this, you're up to 40% success rate, at least one impact, which is kind of a loose criteria, but I think we're making progress. We're getting better programs. And I think this is a strategy that we should follow in more social programs, and especially if combined with emphasis on the outcomes, as Robert is advocating here, I think that's the way to go.
It's not
Go
emphasis, though. It's you have to create a market incentive.
Yeah.
You can't just say.
Wait, I'm agreeing with you.
Say,
but
okay.
why are you arguing with me? I'm agreeing with you.
Argue by nature.
Yeah,
All right. All right. So we're getting now close to the end, but I do have a question. If you measure poverty correctly, and base it on how the extent to which people are able to earn their way out of poverty or labor force participation, where we are now is not satisfactory. Where will we be in 4 years, and what will be the most important thing the Trump administration could do to make it so that more people were earning their way out of poverty? You go first.
All right. There are three different concepts of poverty. And debates about this are very confused because these things are mixed, or the emphasis is put on the wrong one. The first one is what I call income poverty before welfare. Now, when you hear the census reports of how many people, there are 40 million people that are poor, most people don't understand that the entire welfare state is not counted there, okay? So food stamps is not income, EITC is not income, nothing is income. So it's in fact a very good measure of what I would call self-sufficiency, the ability to support your family above the poverty level without reliance on means-tested welfare aid. It's an accident, but that's in fact what it measures. And then there's another concept, which I would call income poverty after welfare. And the best way to measure that is through something called the Consumer Expenditure Survey. And when you do that, you're catching the value of the EITC and food stamps and stuff. And in fact, the poverty rate is cut in half. Things like deep poverty disappear completely. And that's important because contrary to conservative mythology, you really can't spend $1.1 trillion and have no effect on poverty whatsoever. I mean, not even the government can do that, okay? So, in fact, we spend a lot of money, and these benefits do raise the living standards of people, but they need to do it in a positive measure. And that brings me to what I call behavioral poverty, which is, in fact, a measure of 7 behaviors, including dropping out of high school, not working full-time because of compromised work ethic, being a single parent, not having a father in the home, criminal activity, drug abuse and dependence, low quality home environment. You have all heard, for example, that middle class mothers speak to their infant children 3 times as much as a poor mother does. And then finally, welfare dependence. Those 7 factors are what drives income poverty, okay? In fact, you're not going to be income poor unless you do one of the 3 things of dropping out of high school, having low labor force and participation in work, being a single mother, or so forth. If you do those 3 things, you get married, join the labor force, graduate from high school, you're not going to be poor in the United States. You're certainly not going to be persistently poor.
So you want to reduce...
And they're all correlated with each other. They're all correlated. The deal that we ought to be doing, the more important thing, though, is not the income. It's that those 7 behaviors have a direct, devastating effect on human well-being, okay? And frankly, Washington could care less, okay? So you could have everybody's income could be doubled, and if those behaviors were not altered, there really would be very little improvement in human well-being. The number 1 and 2 conditions that produce human happiness are having a healthy, stable marriage and having a job, okay? So we have a welfare system that encourages people not to work and penalizes them when they get married. Way to go, guys, you know? And that we need to focus on reducing those 7 behaviors as a way of improving human well-being, and a side effect of that will be that income poverty will go way down.
Ron?
I think the 2 most important things, I like the marriage initiative, but I don't think the evidence is going to show that it will have a huge impact. But I do think if we had this kind of unified work requirement across programs, we could increase work rates. And that would have a lot of impacts that we've already talked about up here. So that's the most important thing. The second thing is I think we ought to have very strong programs to reduce non-marital birth. Non-marital birth is the beginning of our biggest problems. We've all agreed, I think, that marriage is huge. Non-marital birth has an impact on marriage rates. It reduces marriage rates because men are reluctant to marry women who already have other children. So I think we should do that. That would mean that the administration should reverse its decision about coverage of birth control, because birth control is a way to avoid, I mean, if you think you can control sex and get people to stop doing sex, the reason we have so many non-marital births, and it's gone up so much for every group in society, every group below, say, middle class, is because marriage rates have fallen so much and sex is going to continue, so people are more likely to get pregnant. So let's help them, and we have lots of very good random assignment studies that show that you can do this, and it would reduce the abortion rate. So why in the world wouldn't we make it easy for women to get the best, of their own choice, get the best birth control possible? That's what
I think you're referring to the decision to allow businesses to opt out of providing contraception based on a religious objection. But they have not made a decision with regard to Medicaid coverage of contraception, I don't believe, or have they? Do you know, or do you want to get into?
Well,
what are the 2 things? And
So first of all, I agree with both of them. You were much more explicit, but you were the one who actually coined the phrase, the success sequence. If we can get young people to understand that if they do these 3 things and do them in sequence, not just, you know, sometime, which is to graduate from high school, get a job, and get married before you have a child. You do those 3 things and you do them in sequence, the odds that you're going to be living in poverty is very, very small. If you don't do them, then the odds, if you don't do all 3, the odds are very high you're going to be living in poverty. So helping people understand that this sequence really matters, I think, is one of the things that is really important. And Ron, you get a lot of credit for putting the empirical evidence behind that proposition. So I'll answer the contraception thing first, and I would say one last point, because I don't want to end on contraception. That, you know, it's that the Trump administration did not. Sometimes when I read what they did, I go, gee, did they make contraception illegal? They did not make contraception illegal. Let me sort of make that clear. And if you're an employer that wants to provide contraception through your health insurance, you can still do that. If you want to buy it on your own, you can still do that. They have not made any change to the Medicaid program that I'm aware of in terms of access to contraception. So it just simply says, if you are someone who, you're an employer and you have a strong moral objection to not, to certain types of contraception or the entire plan in place, you can provide insurance that doesn't cover that. That's basically what it says. So you don't have to agree with that. You don't have to agree that employers have religious freedom rights in America, but that's the position the Trump administration took. Now, the last thing I say about work, and to me this is really important. Work is not static, it is dynamic. My first job was picking up golf balls at a golf range. Now, the way that you hear people talk about getting a job, they can't just get a job, they have to get a good job. And a good job means a job with career advancement potential. So, when I got a job picking up golf balls, that was a lousy job for me because I am not a golf pro today. That is not true. That first job for me was very important because it taught me certain things about working, arriving on time. When your supervisor says do this, you say okay. And then you get a paycheck at the end of the week or every 2 weeks, and that's your money, and you get to spend it how you want to. So there are certain, what they call soft skills that you learn with jobs. So I think we have to get rid of this idea that the only good job is a job that has career lateral potential, because people learn very important skills in any job. I have a cousin, and I'm going to end this story.
Yes.
I have a cousin who started flipping hamburgers at Wendy's. Now that is the example that everybody that hates, low-skilled jobs uses. What, you want that person to go flip hamburgers at, McDonald's? Well, I have a cousin who flipped hamburgers at Wendy's. Somebody came to him and said, you seem like a young, enterprising young guy. Would you like to go to management school? Sure, I'll go to management school. He went to management school. And now all of this, while he's doing that, he's going to college. They're supporting him going to college. He wound up owning 30 Wendy franchises. And he has a boardroom in the Wendy's headquarters named after him. He is in the Wendy's Hall of Fame, and he's well off. He's one of those rich people we're trying to soak so that we can balance the budget. But he started by flipping hamburgers. Now, two examples, one where there was a career ladder, one where there wasn't. But both of them started with an entry-level job. Entry-level jobs have dignity, they give us self-worth, they structure our lives, they improve our health. And if we're going to tackle poverty in America, we got to get rid of this idea that there are bad jobs and there are good jobs. There are jobs, and when you go, you show up and you get paid for it. And then from there, you get your next job. And from there, you get your next job. If you're always sitting around saying, unless I get a job for $25 an hour, I ain't starting work, we're never going to solve the problem.
So we've gotten a good picture for all of you of what the conservative leaders of welfare policy for the past 15 years are like and what they say. And I took up all the questions, and I'm sorry about that. We have time for one question, and I want to see if there's anyone that I would want to call on.
You really know how to win a crowd, don't you?
Yeah. Yes, sir. You right there with the beard. Do we have a mic back here? Yeah. And you have to. We want a question, not a statement. And not too long, because we don't have that much time. That's what I've been told to tell questioners. So
all right, perfect.
I hope that doesn't
Gideon
sound too
Sanford from Guide Wealth Management. I appreciate that you gentlemen have never applied for or received any welfare benefits at all, but as somebody who's received EIC, SNAP, and Medicaid over the years, it seems to me that the work requirements you're describing create an enormous additional burden on the people who have to meet the additional requirements and are rejected because they don't meet them, but also an additional burden on the people who have to meet the new requirements and do meet them. So it seems like the system you're describing creates an enormous additional burden on people whose time is the most limited, and that reflects a kind of lack of value for the time of the working class people who are benefiting from these policies.
Okay, so the question is about the burdens imposed. I used to run these programs, and I used to serve people who applied. And anytime you ask an additional question or involve a different process, it makes the application go longer. And you asked it about people who they were talking about who had no job and were able-bodied. And so how do you respond to that, this added burden that might come with a go ahead.
I'm stunned. I can't imagine what you're talking about. With respect to an able-bodied adult without dependent children receiving food stamps, those individuals are sitting at home. 90% of them are completely unemployed, so they're doing nothing as far as we can see in the average week. The norm, half the TANF caseload is sitting at home collecting checks, doing nothing as far as we can see. And so what, for example, with an ABOD's work requirement, what you're saying, as they said in Maine, look, we're giving you about $200 a month. We would make this sort of like a job, okay? So in exchange for the $200 a month we're giving you, we'd like you to come down to the office and do community service work for 6 hours a week, okay? It's like a job, okay? Because we feel that simply giving you a benefit without requiring any positive behavior on your part undermines you and reduces your ability to succeed in society. If you were to go back 20 years ago to when we replaced the aid to families with dependent children, there is just a mountain of literature that showed that program had significant negative effects on mothers and children precisely because it generated this idle dependence which you seem to highly value. If the person is already working, for example, in the food stamp program, they wouldn't be bothered by any type of work requirement. If you look at the Jordan Lee bill, for example, those who have over 20 hours of work of current employment, they're just left alone. But the ones that have been sitting on the caseload for, say, 6 months or more for parents and are not working at all, the bill goes in and it says, I think we're going to nudge you, okay? We're not going to penalize you. We're not going to cut your benefits off or anything like that. I've never supported any program ever in my entire career here in Washington that simply cuts somebody's benefits off. We say, look, we want to help you, but we expect you to take steps to help yourself in return. That, as Wade, I think all of us said, about 90% of Democrats support that idea, okay? And because they understand, that's what, if you wanted to help your own kid, you would never say, hey, you know what? Here's $200. Go sit at home, play video games, have a good time. You'd never do it. But you do it to poor people.
Any other comment on this barrier issue?
I'm not astounded. I hear this kind of point all the time, but I profoundly disagree with it. An inconvenience for someone who's living on the public purse? No, it's not an inconvenience. It's an attempt to get them to do what other Americans expect them to do, who are paying taxes so that they can get the benefit. And they expect something in return. It's totally reasonable. 90% of the public supports it. So we're doing the right thing.
Do you know who John Rawls is? Do you? You do. Do you know that John Rawls opposed giving welfare to non-working, idle, able-bodied people? He called it the surfer exemption. He said, if surfers don't want to work, they're going to have to get along on their own because they won't be part of the transfer system. That's John Rawls. So you're way beyond John Rawls.
All right. It's about proving the work requirement, not about the work requirement itself.
What?
The question was about proving the
work requirement. It's pretty easy. You just have to come down to the office. You show up like a job.
It does impose an additional burden on the agency. That's true. The agency has to do more work. The state or local or city agency that's providing the assistance. So I ran those programs, and it's a lot easier to just say, here's your card, I'll see you in a year. So there is a burden there. There's a burden on both sides, but not all burdens are bad.
Burden's the wrong word. It's their responsibility as an agency. They should be doing that.
Right.
And so,
all right, last word,
60
Wade.
seconds. So it depends on how you view work in exchange for benefits for able-bodied people. If you view it as a punishment, then I accept your premise. But if what you view it as I do, is you are extending help to someone because we know one thing for certain. There's very few things I can say in this world with 100% certainty, but this is one. As long as you are in TANF, you're going to be poor. Because if you start to earn enough, and you're no longer eligible for TANF. So should we be satisfied that someone is poor? And my answer is no, and I think your answer is no too. I think you're not arguing that work is a bad thing. You're not arguing that people should not be helped to get employed and become self-sufficient. I think what you're saying is, are there people on the rolls for whom a work requirement may just be too much for them and creates a burden that they would then see this as some kind of punishment, or they'd simply drop off and like become even poorer without the benefits? You know, we should all worry about that. We should all worry about that. And I think the studies on TANF leavers shows that while most of the TANF leavers left for jobs, a certain percentage got worse. And we should worry about that. And we should try to figure out what to do about that group of people who are worse off because of the work requirement. But it seems to me, and the only but I'd say to that is, at the end of the day, I'm still in favor of work requirement for able-bodied persons with no known barriers to work, because at the end of the day, I know working is better than non-working. Being self-sufficient is better than being dependent, and that work is something that helps most of us structure our lives and gives our lives meaning. And I think that's something that everybody should, we should all aspire for everybody.
All right, thank you very much. I hope you'll give a round of applause. Very good. Thank you.